So I'd like to start by just saying that this talk is going to draw mostly on my own experience, which has ranged across different scales of intervention and activity, from the local to the somewhat global to the virtual and back to the local, which is where I'll end. It begins in a very embodied way, and I will mostly be speaking in the political realm because there's a lot of anthropology of disaster. I'll be speaking to a little bit of it, but I'd like to acknowledge it at the outset just to get things started to frame some of the discussion. These are some themes that I'll be drawing on. And this is moving from not just the anthropology of disaster, but overall the anthropological accounts of disaster that have reevaluated and redefined disasters and the hazards leading to them as basic, often chronic elements of environments, and more significantly, as happenings humans themselves to some degree construct. So we'll be talking about disaster here, and the earthquake in Nepal is obviously a natural disaster, but I won't be reducing how powerful the natural elements are, but there are a number of other overlaid and intersecting themes that make this far more complicated. And in my own experience, for better or worse, I've learned a great deal about. So throughout, as I mentioned, we'll be beginning with the embodied disaster, the immediacy, and the uncertainty and the immensity of what occurs when a disaster happens. I've referenced briefly the anthropology of disaster. I'll be weaving that throughout. Narrations of disaster. Who has the authority to speak? Who has the authority to define disaster? Disaster assumes in its framing a certain level of unpredictability or irregularity, a certain amount of extraordinary circumstance and extraordinary powers to respond. Who defines those powers? Who defines what is normal? Who defines what is abnormal in both the moment of disaster and the aftermath? Who defines what is an appropriate response or an appropriate time frame? We'll be talking about scale throughout. Again, I'll have the next slide will show, but we'll be talking both. We're talking about spatial, temporal, and social scales. Social being a cross-cutting issue. I think it's better if I'm not so close to the microphone. Thanks. As you can see, I'm not so seasoned with the dais. Mostly, this is even better? Yeah. Great. I'm much more comfortable like this. So we have spatial, temporal, and social scales of disaster, and they're intersecting and overlapping. And then importantly, there are scale-making projects. So this is to say that scale is not something that can be taken for granted. It's not something that exists. It is produced, and in its production, there are politics interwoven into the definition of scale and into the capability of scale. Scale-making projects is a term that comes from Anna Singh, a woman who I've drawn heavily on in my other research on hydropower development. The idea of a scale-making project has it in producing a certain scale and defining how it articulates with other scale-making projects. You empower a certain idea of scale for specific ends. This links later to the idea of some symbolic violence, which is a term borrowed from Bourdieu. And to the extent in which scale is taken for granted and not witnessed, it becomes ever more powerful. The politics of visibility, legibility, and recognition. These are just three different themes you could think about when thinking about the scalar politics of disaster and aftermath. Who is visible and why? How do you become legible to certain responders? How do you become officially affected? How do you become a beneficiary, and to whom? Recognition, how does your suffering or how does the effects of disaster, how do you define them, in what language, and how is that received? How do you take up the language that others give you? Political subjectivities. Nepal is an ever-changing place. I'll do my best to paint some broad strokes about the general political background. But if you can imagine, at the time the earthquake occurred in Nepal, they had spent 7 years trying to hammer out a constitution. They had one entirely failed constituent assembly and another that was later reenacted in 2013. There are major questions about the division of federal states, and there's no local government. So at the time, to put it lightly, if you can imagine what it's like having a massive natural disaster in an election year, this is far greater and more volatile political regime. And all of those, the political and specific history of Nepal certainly informs the way that disaster was understood, responded to, and ultimately propagated throughout time since the event of the earthquake on April 25th. I mentioned symbolic violence and exclusion. This is to say that disaster is not experienced evenly. The reason it's not experienced evenly often relates to long-standing patterns of social exclusion, structural inequality, and symbolic violence in this context also means, in the context of recovery and reconstruction, stating that something is in its own right a good in terms of reconstruction often hides the fact that there are political motives and that there are ways that the notion of reconstruction in a certain way, or the notion of responding to disaster in a certain way, perpetuates certain political agendas and certain types of symbolic violence. Disaster and development, this is where I'll bring my own long-term research to intersect with what I've been doing since the earthquake. My research is on hydropower development and infrastructure. There's an incredible amount of important and changing questions that are arising now in the wake of the earthquake about how these things will be reimagined, how and if things will be reimagined, what sort of new opportunities are open and closed, what kind of development futures. Building back better, this is a term that comes floating across the disaster networks from other places. This references the fact that building back better is a term that's been used in places as far-reaching as Haiti, Japan, and Gujarat. What does it mean to build back better, on whose terms, and for whom? Alternative approaches to resilience, a term that's increasingly popular in Nepal, which does good and does harm. There are ways to talk about resilience that are empowering. There are ways to talk about resilience that recognize the innate social qualities of resilience. And there are ways to talk about it that are perhaps removed or abstract. And there are ways to talk about it that are downright insulting. To say that the Nepali people are resilient is meant to be a compliment in some framings, but in others it means they'll take care of themselves, and we don't have to. So, to move forward, the production and interpenetration of different scales. We mentioned the spatial, the temporal, and the social before. Here are just a couple of examples of types of scale-making projects. In my own thinking, there are many. These are just examples of ways in which different scales interact and different projects that have to do with scale interact. So you have your physical geographies and the natural topography, which affects access in terms of disaster response. And you have political geographies, which affect different governance regimes, who is responsible and where and for how wide of an area. Questions of governance in the background that affect Nepal, such as questions about federalism, the division of Nepal into large administrative states, and the lack of local government, which I mentioned, which is a huge question when you're trying to respond at a local level, the so-called last mile, which is where a majority of my own work has been done. And geographies. This is a popular theme for those who study the social science of conservation and development. Certain landscapes become territorialized by NGOs and other organizations coming to do their own work with their own agendas. How does the landscape, the post-disaster landscape of Nepal, how is it carved up? How is it shaped by the interventions of different NGOs? And how is this outside of the official government? How does this institute new forms of government and political subjectivity? The temporal scale, this is a particular interest of mine, and you'll see why later. You have the idea of the emergency phase. You have the idea of early recovery, which is this liminal phase that extends into emergency and on into recovery. You have the first 100 days. You have the first 48 hours. You have all these different official framings that you have biweekly reports into the cluster system. You have all these disaster terminologies and units of time that are relevant immediately, that become relevant immediately after disaster. And then you have more long-term lived temporal frames that have everything to do with how a disaster is experienced, such as monsoons, seasonal variations, for example, harvests, and funerary rites, which in the context of my own experience and talk will become very important. In the social realms, you have different types of affectedness, drawing and determining scale, saying we're all affected in a similar way. Identities, pre-existing and new. Because I'm affected in a certain way, I have certain claims to a type of identity. Solidarity, alignments, and difference, the opposite. An important social framing and scale that I'd like to point out here has been coined by Mukta Singh Lama and a few other scholars, my own advisors at Cornell included, Catherine March and David Holmberg, and used by others like Deepak Thapa and I believe Sarah Tamang talking about the earthquake. There are different ways to name the earthquake of 2015. Importantly, first, it's not an earthquake, it's plural, it's earthquakes, but in common parlance it's discussed as the Gorkha earthquake, which assigns a certain location to it and actually interestingly maps onto a brave history of Nepal. The Tamsaling tragedy is a name that's been given to it to reflect the fact that an inordinate portion of people of the Tamang ethnicity, which I work very closely within that group, different types, there are different subgroups within Tamang ethnicity and culture, but the idea of Tamsaling is an ethnic name for one of the proposed federal states of Nepal, and saying that the Tamsaling tragedy marks this as a type of disaster that falls unevenly on social lines. And the fact that Tamangs were excessively affected, and when you ask the question of why, the answers are earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people, landslides kill people. And this particular ethnic group, among others, was excessively exposed to certain types of risk, which falls back into the anthropology of disaster and says certain people and certain types of risk are deemed acceptable, while others are not. So going forward, thinking about disaster response management, who should be exposed to certain types of risk? What kinds of risk are acceptable? And do we have an opportunity to redefine risk? This is just to show sort of the trajectory, my own, and where I'll be going in this talk. Very personal and the embodied. I ended up by pure chance being in one of the most affected areas of the entire country, the entire Himalaya at the time of the earthquake. And then I was immediately, well, not immediately, but 60 hours later evacuated and shuttled back to the national capital, where there were all sorts of global conversations and actions going on. And then slowly I learned more about the other interstitial sort of scales of subnational, national, clusters, different types of response, different ways you articulate it on certain levels with certain groups. And this is just the trajectory that I'll roughly follow today, to start with me and where I was, where my family was, and then I'll filter back towards that place where I was, where I'm still working at the end. This is a now extremely widespread, almost meme-like depiction of what happens emotionally in a simplistic model in the aftermath of disaster. And to some extent, there are parts of this that are true. I won't go into detail about them, but at the moment. But you have multiple states of disaster, and it extends over time. So this is one way of thinking about the temporal scale of disaster, where you have the impact, you have excitement about the heroism, the volunteerism, the social media, the crowdsourced mapping effort, the local VDC secretary, whoever is there. You have enthusiasm for what's been done. You have this idea of community cohesion, which was very, very popular in Nepal in the near-term aftermath. You had the idea that high caste Hindus and Dalits, or in another South Asian context, what you would call untouchables, are engaging or working together to restore communities, or suffering equally and understanding each other's plight. Now, this is my own opinion, but that fell apart rather quickly. And then you have this trough of disillusionment, and you have these other trigger events, which are other earthquakes, which are monsoons, which are landslides, which are aftershocks of what you might call PTSD in the Western context. You have this overall malaise and lack of faith in what the government may or may not be doing for you. You have this idea of an anniversary reaction is quite interesting, because we will be having an anniversary reaction in the Langtang Valley where I was shortly upon my return to Kathmandu next month. And then you have working through grief and long-term reconstruction, of which is still largely uncertain in Nepal. I don't completely subscribe to this. I think it's interesting to think with. Another interesting thing to think with, defining risk in the Himalaya. This is from Roger Billam and others who published this in Science in 2001. This is a simplistic depiction of what the fault line looks like along the Himalayan arc. In the upper right, you sort of see the idea that the Indian plate is subducting and it sticks, and it builds up stress, and then it shifts at certain moments. And though unpredictable, the mechanism is understood. And here across the arc, what you have are representations of potentiality of earthquakes. You also have the boxes are the red is what's been recorded in the past, and the boxes are potential uncertainty. The official caption that goes with this is, "This view of the Indo-Asian collision zone shows the estimated slip potential along the Himalayan fault line. Shaded areas with dates next to them surround epicenters and zones of rupture of the major earthquakes in the Himalaya and the Kutch region, where the 2011 Bhuj earthquake occurred in Gujarat. Red segments along the bars show the slip potential on a scale of 1 to 10 meters. That is the potential slip that has accumulated since the last recorded great earthquake, or since 1800. The pink portions show possible additional slip permitted by ignorance of the preceding historic record." So here you have knowledge presented, but you also have lack of knowledge presented. You have ignorance presented. This is to show at a simple level that all along the Himalayan arc, and this is what you'll hear about in PBS documentaries and others, there's still a huge potential. And it's recurrent, and the mechanism is understood, but the time is uncertain. This is a very interesting finding from a very recent paper that was published in Science, which I will also be quoting later to talk about Langtang. They found that Pokhara, a city in the center of Nepal, was built upon debris generated by at least 3 medieval earthquakes of magnitude 8 or greater, occurring in approximately 1100, 1255, and 1344. That's a terribly frightening fact, that the entire city is built on this. And I think we have people in the audience who live in Pokhara who just found this out. The point is, there's a historical scale that's important here. Recurrence and memory. This is just a Google search of images that have been archival images from the Great Earthquake of 1934, the last major earthquake that struck Nepal. This will come back later when we talk about archives. These are this is living memory. These are, I don't know what 90 plus is, but the equivalent of octogenarians, but in the 90s, who have lived through both earthquakes. The photograph on the left was taken by me in Sindhupalchok. This man lived through 2 earthquakes in the same house. The woman on the right, the photograph comes from the Wall Street Journal. They did a short story on these people who have lived through 2. But this is, again, to show and continue to stress the social nature of earthquakes and the fact that it is embodied in physical experience and in memory. Back to the anthropology of disaster. The introduction of social factors in causation made it clear that disasters further involved diachronicity. Calamities emanated from processes that developed over long periods of time as much as from sudden crises. Conditions that spawned or eventually terminated in what people then viewed as dire, harmful, and often horrific emergency had in fact accrued manifestly or latently under their noses. Think of the Tom Selleck tragedy. This is two different directional interpretations of the relationship between disaster and culture. The first is from a thinker named Sorkin, sort of outdated at this point, seen as too programmatic, too essentializing. Disaster recreates culture in its own image. And then the later one was introduced by Edward Simpson, discussing the Gujarat earthquake, that culture recreates disaster in its own image. I would argue, depending upon how you define disaster as a moment or as a flow, that the latter applies greatly in Nepal. But the productive tension between these two ideas is extremely helpful, I find, in thinking about the earthquake. Here we have some renderings. Let's see if these make sense. This is a depiction of ground motion. The maximum ground motion observed was 100 centimeters per second, the velocity, the peak velocity, and 0.2 Gs at max. This shows roughly the affected zones of the first earthquake that occurred on April 25th at 11:56 a.m., 7.8 magnitude, and it spans from the epicenter in the west, in central Nepal in Gorkha. And you can see that the slip and the seismic activity actually moved, the shock wave, so to speak, moved to the east. This is the distribution. This is another way to think about it, with more aftershocks mapped, including the 7.3 that occurred on May 12th over in Sindhupalchok. And you start to see that that there are multiple forces at work acting upon each other. So that the scale changes when you start talking about one earthquake versus multiple earthquakes. And in fact, as we know, there are more casualties, almost 3,000 casualties in Sindhupalchok, which is actually quite far from the initial epicenter. So there are multiple ways to talk about the epicenter of earthquakes. You can talk about the spatial, the temporal, the social epicenter. And in some ways, some people, particularly those from Langtang, would certainly say that Langtang was their epicenter. So these are more numbers, and the question is, does this make sense? Does this help? It does if you have a certain understanding of the language of seismology, or if you're experienced in Nepal. But the point here is that you have an incredible amount of data that's generated, and it's understood in certain ways, but there are many other ways to look at it, and I think most people are familiar with this, but I'll leave it up for a second in case you're not. The important thing to think, one of the important things to look at when it comes to the social and political scale are the last 2 points. 4.4 billion and change was pledged in June 2015 at the Donors Conference. And 10 months since the April 25th earthquake, they're still formulating a strategy to respond correctly and appropriately, according to whom? Uncertainty on a Himalayan Scale is a play on a very famous book that was written back in the 1980s. This quote is not from that book, but the point here is that uncertainty does not simply exist. It is produced, it colors societies, it informs social and political formations, it creates conflicts in public discourse, and in some cases, it can overwhelm an entire society. In Nepal, the disaster continues because of the contours of uncertainty. The initial event inflicted certain kinds of uncertainty that are lingering, and there are several other cascading uncertainties that have affected new patterns of uncertainty that interfere and produce new effects and attenuate uncertainty in certain locations and times. That's it for the theory. So now I'd like to just step back to talk about where I was at the time of the earthquake. This is Langtang, the Langtang Valley. This area up through here is uninhabited. This is Kenjingompa. Langtang itself is here. You can begin to see the avalanche. This is the valley that you walk up to come to Langtang. It's near the border of Tibet. This is a photograph of the Langtang Lirung Glacier, taken the day before the earthquake, the morning before. This shows you the proximity of Langtang to Kathmandu. This is Langtang up here. This is the point of access, which you can see connects to the Tibetan Plateau. This is Rasuagadi, an area, the border crossing I've spent a great deal of time in the last few years. This over here is the only other road that crosses into the Tibetan Plateau, a trans-Himalayan motorable road in Sindupalchok, which was also heavily affected by the earthquake. So you can start to see that these places are close to Kathmandu, but they're peripheral in their own ways, and then they become central again. Langtang is a particularly charismatic place. I use both of these terms at the top, globalized and locality, in the way that they're propagated. I don't adopt them, but the fact of the matter is that Langtang is understood as being this very local place that is inherently visible and global because of the type of tourism that's been promoted there. People come, and there's lots of literature on this in the Himalayan tradition, and consume a Himalayan experience, and that includes people, that includes landscape. For these reasons, it's a place it's very local, but it's known. Actually, who here has been to Langtang? So there you go. Oh, sorry, overeager. These are my parents. They're right there. My dad's actually wearing the same shirt. So we were in Langtang at the time of the earthquake. We went unknowingly, not knowing I knew what to expect in Langtang itself for the trek, but not knowing at all what would happen in the duration. We were there with our own different relationships to the place, and it changed around us. This is the day before the earthquake, coming back down to Langtang. This is the village of Langtang, which is a certain point within the overall valley. And yeah, that might be a good idea to make the photograph show up better. Thank you. It's going to be a lot of photos from here on out.
Sorry, bear with me. I'm not exactly sure what's going on.
Thank you, Andy.
That was not it.
That helps.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm trying to get those spotlights up.
Great.
That's good. Yeah?
Yeah, I think that's good enough.
All right.
Thank you, Andy. Oh, now everything. Okay, great, perfect. That's fine.
Is this okay?
I think so.
Can you read?
I'm not reading anymore.
Cameraman,
Oh,
This is great. This is great. This is great. I prefer my images being recorded rather than myself. So this is coming back down to Langtang. We had gone up past, we had spent 2 nights in the village, and we were returning to the village. This is inside the monastery. There are 2 monasteries in the Langtang Valley, one at the top in Khenchen-Gompa and another in Langtang itself in the lower village in an area called Gumba. This is the Langtang Gompa itself, the monastery. And this is a Gewa ceremony. It's a funerary ceremony that was performed for one older man in the community who died the night before. Actually, my mistake. This is the 49th day after he passed away. This is the final Gewa ceremony that it symbolizes the soul leaving the bardo and his reincarnation. This is you'll see why I'm going into detail on this later. And I've also written a short piece in cultural anthropology on the topic of Gewa. This is a unit of circular time in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that helped to deal with grief. And it's a unit of time that became particularly relevant because we encountered this the night before the earthquake, a funerary ceremony. There's dances going on throughout the night. It went from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. We only stayed for a few hours. There was about 300, I would estimate, people coming from all around the valley, convening in the area. And this is the community in the downstairs of the Gompa. If I can get this to work, I just want to show you what it sounds like. Oh, well, it's only on my computer, but... And I hope the point in showing you that is to make it feel more real. The next day, that Gompa and this place, this is where we were at the time of the earthquake, in Goratabella, a little bit below this. The next day, the earthquake occurred, and that entire Gompa and many of the people in the Gompa at that time were killed. This is the moment of the earthquake. Again, bear with me, the sound isn't great. This is a video I took when the earthquake occurred as I turned around after running. My family was slightly down the path. I had sent them ahead and was talking to the local, one of the local guys, now a friend, Dindu Jangba. And I ran into the open field to get away from what I thought was just a landslide. And when I stopped, I realized that the whole ground was moving and it was much bigger. This is what it looks like. It's very short. I'm surprised I had my wits about me to take a photograph. But I think it's important to show you. This, and it's one of just many. That very palpable, massive slope failure that you just saw is one of about 8 to 10 that were in the area around where we were, which is on this map slightly down here in the left corner. This is the major avalanche that occurred. It started at about 6,700 meters up on the slopes, on the ridge line sloping to the west from Langtang, the room. and triggered this massive avalanche that swept down. I reoriented this image to show you the vector. You can see here it jumps a cliff. There are some statistics I'll show you in a moment. It reaches the valley floor and crosses the river, and there's a blast zone on the other side. We didn't know that this had occurred because what was happening around us was so intense, and there was debris coming down on all sides, and there was aftershock after aftershock. The air hadn't cleared. We didn't know that, that the avalanche had occurred until we looked upslope, and we could see after the air cleared after about 15 minutes. This is some statistics from an article recently published in Science. These are my paraphrasings to make it a little bit more readable. But you can see, as I said, it fell from very high. The debris fell over 3,000 meters, which is about 10,000 feet. And when it reached the valley floor, it was moving at around 140 miles an hour. And it blasted, it buried 1 kilometer in either direction and crossed the river and went 200 meters up the slope. The blast zone, which expands beyond the area that was buried, was leveled by winds exceeding 322 kilometers an hour, over 200 mile an hour winds. Just blew down buildings, everything in its path, including the monastery that this I showed you that we were singing in. The mass of the avalanche was 8 kilograms, and it released, because of the mass and the velocity which it was traveling, it released enough force to be equivalent to half of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. So this is intensely studied by a massive team of scientists, some from ISIMO and some who were friends. It's terrifying. This is another account. It was published in Outside magazine, talking about the houses that were destroyed and other accounts. You can see at the bottom, it's estimated that over 308 people died. That's an unofficial estimate because there are still people missing. That means that there are still some people buried, and it also means that there are bodies decomposing in the teaching hospital that people are struggling to mobilize resources to do DNA tests for, including some people who we met in the days before. This is where the avalanche came from. I took this photograph the morning we were going up in the other direction. And this is basically the cliff that it descended upon. It's an interesting story. It relates even to climate adaptation because, as you can see, this place has experienced some slope failures in the past. As late as, I think, 1960s and 70s, there was still periodically icefall coming over the area here, as there is in different points throughout the valley. And there actually is an interesting history of building Mani walls to point out which areas are unsafe to build. It's an intergenerational type of transfer. Here, up until the 1970s, there was debris coming over this head wall, and therefore people didn't build here. Once the glacier ablated and moved back a little bit further, the end moraine and the deposition pattern was different, meaning rocks and ice weren't falling over the edge anymore. They were stopping and building up a barrier up top. So people thought it might be safe to build. And when the tourism economy took off, this is an area where people built guest houses. So it's a story of multiple factors. This is a photo taken by a good friend, Athena Zelandoni, to the internet known as Athena Aurora. This is in Sindum. It's not Langtang village. It's completely covered in snow because there were multiple avalanches, because there were blast zones and air currents that circulated snow and deposited it in different places. Where she was in Kanjing Gompa was also covered in snow, and there was a blast that tore down metal fences. And this is from a second avalanche that is poorly understood. This is Langtang. This is from the same point that I showed you the photo I took the day before. This was taken by Athena, I think 2 or 3 days following. And you can see in the foreground is the village that was destroyed by the blast, covered in snow. In the rear ground, it's hard to tell to delineate between the boundary of what was buried and what was destroyed by the wind, but in the rear ground, that's just that's where the deposition was, and that's where the mass is just, it's buried. This is flying over it, looking out. You can see that before the snow melted, you can see the scale. The monastery that we were at the night before is over here, just outside of the frame. It was completely destroyed also by the wind. This is a helicopter flying up into the valley, the first helicopter that responded, the Army helicopter the next morning. This is what we could see from where I stood. This is my photograph. We could see that everything that was supposed to be there was gone. Photos from Athena showing people looking for survivors, people moving those who were injured. This is the same photo down where the Army had dropped personnel in the immediate response. This is people, the only survivors coming from above, fewer than a dozen, arriving and convening with the people who had come from below and trying to figure out who was still alive. This is a woman realizing that some of her family members had died. This is us waiting. We didn't have any structures that were viable or that were in safe zones, so we waited in the field and camped in the field for in 2 different places, but for a duration of about 60 hours. And this is where my work began, unbeknownst to me. And a family friend, Rory, who's also in the audience, was still here with me. We had gotten my parents on an earlier helicopter, but no one knew. This photo is uncertainty incarnate. No one knew. There was 40 aftershocks in the first 24 hours over 4.0, 31 over 4.0 in the first 24 hours. The walls kept coming down. We didn't know if we would be exposed to another avalanche or landslide. We didn't know when the helicopters would come. We didn't know what the plan was. We had no contact. We had some food, thankfully, limited shelter, and we were trying to figure out how to communicate with each other. This is a young boy who had a 6-inch piece of splinter buried in the back of his neck. This helicopter is a private helicopter. It landed not to pick up a foreigner, but to pick up a Nepali Army colonel's son who was trekking with his friends. To their defense, they wanted to bring people with them, but the rules of the helicopter, and there were some misunderstandings. There was a tussle between the people who thought that the sick should be evacuated and these people who the helicopter had come for. So this is a foreigner named Victor, who along with myself and a few others were trying to make sure this boy got on the helicopter. I love this image because I met this boy months later and he was fine. And we got him out on this helicopter eventually. And then after this, after what was utter chaos, which I don't like the way it's talked about in the international media, but there was chaos, there was fear, everybody was scared, foreigners, locals, everyone. After this, we kind of decided that we needed a system. So I started trying to negotiate, talk about scale. The Army said that their policy was to evacuate NGO workers first, foreigners second, and then locals last. And I said, if I get all the foreigners here to agree that that's not right, can we change it? And he said, yeah, that's up to you. So I went around and we got all the foreigners to agree. And we got a Slovenian EMT to go around and do a quick triage list and made sure that the next helicopter that came the following morning, we had 27 injured Nepalis and 2 injured foreigners. Which is a shift in the official policy. So this is the first moment where I feel like I did something. This is the organized helicopter the next day. This is some of the injured people getting on it. It looks crazy, but it's not as crazy as some of the other helicopters were. And this was a joy. This was a joy to see the right people getting on the helicopters and then not just being a free-for-all. And again, I'll point out that it wasn't just locals who were acting irresponsibly and trying to get on helicopters. The first helicopters that came, there was many, many people trying to get on there. The locals just weren't there yet because they were still looking for the bodies. This is people not getting on helicopters, which happened just as much. The Army helicopters didn't come. Part of the reason they didn't come is because they had been requisitioned by the government. And the first day they all went to Everest because there was news of Everest, because there was better communications there. They evacuated people there. The news said deadly avalanche on Everest. The order of magnitude of Langtang is logarithmically higher, but the news hadn't filtered out yet. The helicopters didn't come our way until the information percolated through, and then they had to deal with issues like weather, triage in other areas. So there was a lot of frustration. Eventually, everyone got back to Langtang, or to Kathmandu. This is the Langtang camp, internally displaced people's camp at Phuntsok Choling Monastery in Swayambhu. Where at its peak, this place gets a lot denser with the tents. This housed 500 people, and most of the Langtangpa lived here throughout. When I got back, the other thing I found is that people all over the world are looking for family members. I had the very strange experience of talking to people who were looking for family members and advising them as to where I thought they might have been, identifying people from photographs who I had seen at different points in the trail, briefing the U.S. Special Forces on where these people might be, helping the embassy as much as I could, and identifying multiple embassies with who might be where in the Langtang Valley, because there was multiple hazards and different events that trapped people in different places. And then this Facebook page was created, which I think is amazing and phenomenal, and really is reflective of a larger system of response. It is something new under the sun. This comes back to the Yale Himalaya Initiative, because these people were looking for family members. Facebook had come up with this idea that you could mark someone safe. Mark Turin, linguistic anthropologist and technology, disruptive technology inventor, former director of the Yale Himalaya Initiative, got together with a group of people from the Yale Himalaya Initiative students and translated Facebook's mark safe function into Nepali, which immediately doubled or tripled its effectiveness in Nepal, which is amazing because the penetration of social media in Nepal has changed fundamentally in the last 5 to 10 years, such that now this was a very important tool. Langtang Missing Found is the same thing, mostly foreigners looking and searching for more specific data at the beginning. It's since become a support group. You can see it says likes on this page equals I am with you. There's still a mother whose daughter I met the night, few of us met the day before the earthquake, who hasn't had the body identified, who's intensely lobbying to try to do DNA testing for some of the bodies that remain. And it's hard to see the material that's posted on pages like this. This is a local form of grief, so to speak, quote unquote. This is one of the intermediate gewas that was held 3 weeks after the event in Mustang Gompa in Swayambanath. This is a part of the 49-day grieving process, where the soul is reincarnated in Tibetan Buddhist tradition. This is accumulating, gewa means virtue, and accumulating virtue on behalf of the soul. And that's where I'll leave Langtang for now, and I'll shift upwards in scale to talk a little bit about the larger issues. I'll come back to Langtang physically and thematically afterwards. But I think it's an appropriate place to leave it, is in the middle of, okay, I'll have to go very fast. This is the Joint Humanitarian Military Operations Coordination Committee. I showed up here looking for information about Rasua. I realized that, in fact, the people with information with Rasua were me and my friends who were standing next to me. This is a map that shows the areas allotted for air operations. This is a fascinating map. India, China, United States of America. These are different scales. This is the Canadian Emergency Response Unit in the district headquarters in Rasua. This is some of the materials that got flown in. All Red Crosses are not the same. There's been a lot of critiques. There's been a lot of counter critiques. There's been a lot of discussion of what the Red Cross does and does not do, what it has done and hasn't done in past disasters. It's not a homogeneous body. There are many different institutions within the Red Cross, different countries, different responders. In this case, they did quite well. In other cases, not so much. Another meeting, the meetings got bigger. I started to understand more. There was many different organizations coming and framing the disaster, doing these survey research-style reports that are specific to disaster. If you don't know what clusters are, it's a very important thing to understand about disasters. There are 9 different clusters active in Nepal. They're thematically organized on issues like shelter, protection, camp management, a number of different early recovery, which is kind of vague, which I've had a lot of interaction with. This was a special product of the cluster. I'll do this very quickly, but this is supposedly before and after the May 12th earthquake, level of damage reported, which you'll see here in Rasua. The number is around, I think, 80 in this. And after the earthquake, the number goes down in Rasua to 70, because they actually refined their data, they evaluated their data, and they realized that the earlier number was overreported. In Nuwako, however, the district just south, which in my personal experience is not as affected as Rasua, even though the May 12th earthquake was in a different area and Nuwakot was not strongly affected by it, it was an opportunity to shift their numbers, and the numbers went way up to 90%, which is clearly not the level of destruction in Nuwakot. So this has to do with reporting, this has to do with visibility, legibility, and the politics of scale, because one district reports higher than the other, and the districts are different theaters of operation and competing with one another for resources in a way. This is the shelter cluster. This is like 150 people from different organizations in a room, the national meeting, weekly meetings at the beginning, talking about, partnered with the government and the IFRC. This is what they look like. If you're curious, this is the shelter cluster's org chart, which changed multiple times. The shelter cluster has now become the housing reconstruction and recovery platform, which is for reconstruction. Shelter is for intermediate shelter. This is an Mi-8 being built from scratch by a Russian mechanic at the airport. They flew in 3 from Africa, and they built one from scratch because they only had one to begin with. This is for the UN World Food Program for immediate response efforts. It's papered in, for the paint job, it's papered in news from the earthquake. I have a couple of close-up photos that I like to show. This is a reconstruction village from a Chinese consortium, which includes universities and districts and temples, all from China. This is below Dunche and Rasua, so this is probably by road 45 kilometers into Nepal. China cleared the roads side of Nepal. They opened the borders, they came down. China also evacuated its own citizens in working a hydropower project in borderline areas, which is part of the reason why you saw that map before that had the air zones. This is a very important slide. This is a logistics cluster, which is run by the World Food Program, which did an overall fantastic job. Again, not all clusters are equal. The one thing that was very heavily criticized here by people like Sarah Schneiderman, former Yale Himalaya Initiative founder and one of my professors and friends, you have all this typology and symbology up top for how things get to certain places, and at the bottom, what do you have? Nepalis carrying things for the last mile. Clearly, it's much more complex than that. Rasul Relief is a last mile organization. We do start things in Kathmandu, we advise organizations, we do lots of things on a larger scale, but we try to be effective on the local level. And we try to use some kind of local intelligence, however gathered from our own ethnographic, long-term research experience, or just through local networks. We don't always succeed, but we try to hit gaps, and we started on Facebook like everybody else. We're giving a talk at Dartmouth in a couple of days on social media and social entrepreneurship. We'll focus a lot more on the other types of efforts like this in our peer institutions. There were other programs, specifically what was called the Yellow House, the Himalayan Disaster Relief Volunteer Group, which ended up being, although it was an informal group and organized through things like Facebook, the 4th largest distributor of materials in Nepal, competing with organizations like the Red Cross. Again, this level of social media activity and self-organization is something new under the sun, and very important for studies of things like resilience. These are other activities we were involved in. Delivery of tents, moving trucks. I'll show you a summary sheet in a moment. Coordinating meetings with ISIMO to try to facilitate relationships in Langtang, an area where they had done a lot of research, digging toilets, and putting in a self-digesting biodigester tank imported from India at the Langtang Gompa because it was sacred land, and in order to accommodate 500 people, we clearly needed more bathrooms, but the monastery didn't want to disrupt things, so we did that. This is a woman I was evacuated with and her child at the camp, Lakpa. This is another Lakpa, a very good friend of mine, one of the leaders of the committee. And these are people who are not from Langtang. He is a son-in-law. He married someone from Britain VDC, which is elsewhere. And the people from Britain VDC eventually were not comfortable living in the Langtang camp. It felt like they were marginalized, they were critiqued, and people were saying that they were diluting resources. So Langtang is an area I work in a lot, but it has its own micropolitics and issues. This is building a structure with sustainable steps to try to provide an over canopy for the monsoon. This is a website that I built for coordination. This is the link between the grassroots and overall district level shelter cluster activities. Eventually this was taken up by the shelter cluster in imperfect form on their own terms, and they did not hire the Nepali web developers that I recommended that they should, because we built this. The data, we tried to make different kinds of data fungible, and that wasn't to their liking, so they've gone the long way around. But this is an important effort towards coordination I would like to spend more time on, but I don't have more. Again, more photos of just Rasua Relief's activity. We eventually got a logo, which is a red panda, not a raccoon. And we were busy for months and months. This is flying in, this is just to show that, Langtang is not the only place for disaster, even in Rasua. This is Hakubi. This is Goganing here, out of sight. This is Goganing. As you see, a significant part of their lower agricultural land tabbed off, and these areas are not safe to live in any longer. So there's new issues of resettlement that'll have to get negotiated between the hydropower company and others. This is flying into the Tibetan border in a UN helicopter. This is what got me kicked out of the Fulbright program. We're doing an evaluation in an area that nobody had reached yet. This is the village of Timuray, where I had spent months doing research on transboundary infrastructure leading up to the earthquake. This is taken 3 seconds before the second major earthquake in May 12th. I was standing on this is a hearth of a building. They had totally cleared off the second floor already by May 12th. This is the stove, it's the only thing sitting there, and you can see in the background there are scars from landslides. And then everything started shaking again. 7.3 magnitude earthquake, I was back in Rasua, and you could see the mountains coming apart, but felt much more safe than the first time. IDP camps everywhere in Rasua. Old men from Haku in an IDP camp in a different district, which is an extremely controversial topic. The Constituent Assembly, essentially now a parliament member, speaking to the people of Langtang at the IDP camp. There was an audience with a political audience. People from Langtang who had moved abroad, trying to mobilize their own resources. And then finally, after the whole monsoon, we were able to empty the camp as per the agreements with the monastery, and that was a very hopeful moment. And we continue to fly in materials for the reconstruction planning, which is a whole other topic. So to close the chapter on Rasua Relief's general activities, this is a summary. I don't have time to go through it all, but you can see we did a lot of different things. We reached a lot of different households. And at the bottom, one of the things we're most proud of is $0 money paid to non-Nepali staff in 2015. We're a volunteer organization. We hired a few Nepali field managers, but we make sure to do things light and nimble with low overhead, which is important. We were lucky to make that decision. You can't do all work like that. There's a reason for big organizations, but that's what we did. I'll go through this quickly. This is my long-term research on infrastructures. This is my website. This is photographs of what I call the hydropower future, still developing in Nepal. There are huge open questions about infrastructure. This is the gate border of Tibet, TAR, China, in Rasua Gadi, near on the road to Kerong. This is a question on this is a quote on extra statecraft. The fact that infrastructures propagate certain types of relationships. These are some papers that I've written. This is the ongoing work that I'm doing on the hydropower nation. I think citizens of a hydropower nation in the post-earthquake context has everything to do with my research, my PhD. This is an open source map I made of all the hydropower projects in Nepal. I did this before the earthquake. There's 521 projects permitted in different stages across Nepal. We represented some of the plans, existing transmission infrastructure. The different colors and shapes indicate scales and stages of projects. You can find this online at the Niti Foundation, and we're working with it further now. You'll see in the next. These are two different types of hydropower research. This is a national workshop I hosted on the issue of issuing shares for hydropower projects for local people and others. I hosted this workshop a week before the earthquake. And then these guys are in Timuray for Mani Sherpa. Again, it's just a month before the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was questions about the impact of hydropower on Nepal, impact of disaster. Those questions have since been drowned out by the fuel crisis and the blockade and new narratives of energy security and the importance of energy sovereignty and large-scale planning. However, and then interestingly, some of the hydropower facilities were actually used as IDP camps, and some hydropower companies actually responded, and Chinese hydropower companies cleared roads to move to help people get out of affected areas. They have temporary shelters and satellite phones and things that would help with disaster response if the government created a coordinated strategy. This is the hydro map updated with the earthquake layer. So this shows seismic activity in the areas relative to the hydropower projects. This is a conversation that is not being had at an appropriate level, in my opinion. Someone at the event that I mentioned before asked, why don't we put a $2,000 accelerometer on a $20 million dam? And the equipment broke 2 years ago and we never replaced it. In Dolica, area that's below a glacial lake outburst flood prone area, the glacial lake outburst flood early warning system, the Maoists during the conflict stole the batteries years ago, and it wasn't functioning properly when I visited it years ago. Point being, there's not good data, and it wasn't a trial by fire because there was no reservoir, no true reservoir projects, hydropower projects built in the Himalayas. We don't yet know how big projects respond to earthquakes. This needs to be discussed. This is a depiction of what was hoped for, Chinese trucks bringing fuel from China to help Nepal, and then eventually it actually happened. So these are important questions about infrastructure. To close, I'm going to go quickly through, I'll try to quickly. This is the Gewa ceremony that we had 49 days after the earthquake. This is to mourn the souls of everyone who died in Langtang and everyone who died on the day of the earthquake across Nepal. These women are singing the same song you heard before, in a different tone, different feeling. Many, many more people died. It is powerful to be there. And I keep arguing that this social unit of time, 49 days, is extremely relevant and far more relevant than the other scales of time that the disaster responding agencies have put onto it. And it should be acknowledged, and it should be understood. Parts of the Gewa ceremony inside and outside the monastery. 176 figurines wrapped in scarves to memorialize the 176 people from the Langtang community who passed. And then an act of forgetting and remembrance simultaneously, burning photographs of the people who passed away. This photo was taken by my friend Prasit Stopit. It's a beautiful photograph. So then I went back to Langtang. This is flying in from above. Down here, you see this? This is a 3-story building. It's the only building that survives because it's tucked against the cliff. It's actually owned by a very controversial figure in the community. This is a cremation ground impromptu cremation ground that was set up. They burned over 100 bodies here. These are people beginning to rebuild. This is people collecting materials from a helicopter that we helped orchestrate. CGI materials be thrown in X number of bundles per house, X number of bricks and mortar. Lots of planning. There's a Langtang Reconstruction and Management Committee, which is a very interesting model that we've been working with, and I'm an advisor to. We continue to work with. This is an impromptu monastery that was set up in a guest house. This is the guest house actually that we stayed in, if my parents remember. This is the dining room. The roof had been blown off, but they moved all the things from the Gompa in here, and this man was praying when I came in. This is a man living underneath a rock in this temporary shelter that's used by yak herders. This guy's glasses were broken. They'd been broken for a few months, and I fixed them when I met him. This is walking over the debris during we did this inventory of all the existing structures and with our team members from other NGO. This is a man looking for salvage materials from his house. This is where I slept the night before the earthquake. And this is massive boulders that were thrown all the way there. And this is the scale, human scale. Again, you can see it's kind of actually foreshortened here. It's tough to detect how far away everything is, but this is in the center of the blast zone. Yet women are still digging for potatoes amidst the rubble, and in the area above there, it wasn't affected as strongly. This is the Gompa that we were in the night before, and this is some texts that are temporarily protected under a tarp. And this is where I'd like to just talk about what's next and what we're doing now. And it's at the local scale again. We're trying to create something called the Langtang Memory Project. And the goal is to create a resource that can be used by the local people to tell their own story. It's an autoethnographic project as well, which means that we're training them and responding to their interests in how to document and what to document from their own cultural history, teaching young people how to do oral histories and photography classes. We're working with a group of great people. We hope to construct a physical space, and there'll be an online archive and knowledge commons. We'll also be sourcing photographs from people who have been there over the years. If you've been trekking in Nepal, you know that you go up and you take photos. Well, bring it back next time. Well, actually, those photographs are important now for all new reasons. This is one of the more known and established photographers who spent time up there. He also has postcards he wrote back when he was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 70s. This is Nepal Photo Project, one of the models that we're using for crowdsourcing. It was an amazing effort of just hashtag, combine all the photographs across Nepal. It led to things like Photo Kathmandu, another amazing festival. This is our beta website. We're in the process of developing it further. As you can see, there'll be two components, a digital archive, and then some kind of thinking about the physical memory center. But this is we're collaborating with other groups on this who are interested. It seems like an appropriate ethnographic kind of project for working at the local scale that, knowing what we know, we're now able to do that maybe other groups aren't able to do. This is just again, a beta of the archive and the back end of it, and we're hoping that maybe eventually this will be robust and it'll be hosted at a university. This is the autoethnographic part I was talking about. The photographs taken by Langtangpas and telling their own story and sharing it. I'm actually going to Dartmouth where there'll be a exhibition of James Nachtwey and Kevin Brubisky's photographs, two titans in photography. And alongside them, there'll be a slideshow exhibition of the photographs that the Langtangpa themselves have taken. I've curated a number of different photographers, including the Langtangpa. So their first show is going to be at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College. This is Kevin Brubisky walking through with Langtangpa photographers, explaining why and where he took certain shots during Photo Kathmandu Festival. This is an amazing collision of generations of experience, and it's just a wonderful moment. This is some of the people who are from the Langtangpa, Kartak, Lakpa, Time, Dangbu, who are learning the photographic practice. These are some of the photos that one of them took prior. This is a Bombo, a Tamang shaman. This is a pilgrimage event in Langtang. This is recent. This is a puja ceremony in Kathmandu with Rinpoche supporting them. This is the Langtangpa experience of waiting in line for cooking fuel during the winter fuel crisis. This is Langtangpa documenting everyday life in Kathmandu. People salvaging any food they can, which includes houses that are being trucked in from Singapore, by the way. Powerful photographs of everyday life, dealing with getting 35 people on top of a bus. And they're taken by the Langtangpa, which is more important than if they're taken by me. The puja, World Peace Puja with the Shakya Rinpoche from in Pokhara. And this photo was just shared 3 days ago before I left. This young boy who's fantastic, who was there with me in Godatabel at the time of the earthquake. This is his grandmother going back to the area where her family died, and right after she had sort of screamed and let everything out, just catching her breath. It's an amazing photograph. And then we're also trying to preserve photographs that exist or salvage them in some way. And this is a Mani wall that was reconstructed. This is a meeting that was held yesterday. The Langtangpa are documenting this and sharing this on social media and their own Langtang Reconstruction Committee. So I don't like to call it capacity building. It's not my own doing, but it's really great to work with them to see them advancing their own story and making their own really intelligent decisions. Another quick thing, working with Sienna Craig and others from Drokpa, an NGO that focuses on pastoralism, we're going to be flying in to medical practitioners to Langtang to help during the reconstruction phase, to help deal with long-term chronic psychosocial problems that go, actually, in my mind, are completely overlooked. You would think that Langtang would have been an area that was a very sexy project for NGOs, and yet it's a major gap still. So we'll be, one of our final acts, so to speak, as Rasul Relief, other than this archive, is we'll be supporting this type of medical practitioners in a culturally sensitive manner, which is appropriate because the government, we're not a registered NGO, so we can't actually participate in certain kinds of activities, ceremonial practice. And this is where it ends. Alternative narratives of resilience. I just have 4 photographs, just to pretty provocative of discussion. This is referencing the archive that we've been doing, looking at photographs that are in people's albums, going through them with people, listening to their stories, local types of grief, I don't mean local types of grief. I mean specifically socially specific types of grief. Humanitarian Reason Revisited, this is the idea of the Amchi camp, which Sienna Craig calls slow medicine in fast times, which I think is great. That's her photograph. This is a photograph by a friend named Niranjan Shrestha. I'm currently doing a project on people with disabilities in post-earthquake Nepal with the United Nations Development Program. I can't share findings of that, but I'd like to share this photograph, which is, I think, amazing. This girl who's been suffering so much, and there are other photos of the suffering, taking this moment of her own, and just you can tell she's just so totally strong. And this is one of my favorite photographs I've ever seen. And I've had the chance to meet this girl and visit some of these rehabilitation facilities. And then this is a photograph that I took of the same Gompa where we were the night before the earthquake, and these are some of the other scriptures that are still out there in the weather at that point. And I just think this is the point to end on, because it's an open question, and Nepal continues to be defined by uncertainty at multiple scales. Thank you.